Hi there, and welcome to this lecture about the modern times that led to the modern times. Great film by cinematographer Charles Chaplin. And one of the characteristics of those modern times was something called the Great Depression. And we're going to investigate the times, the Depression, and the film in this short talk. Um, it is basically a comedy, but by reading it the right way, we can see it as a contemporary history of the problems of the common man during the Great Depression. And I'm going to point to some scenes in particular toward the end of this talk that indicate um, how Chaplin's insight into the assembly line factory system uh, foreshadow many of the observations of Norbert Wiener's text from the 1950s, The Human Use of Human Beings. For no one is more human than the tramp himself, a famous character created by Charlie Chaplin, and incidentally, Modern Times being the last film where he ever performed in that character. So, the progress of the talk today is to investigate was there really anything so great about the Great Depression? This was the phenomena of my parents' childhood and something that boomers heard about an awful lot. And to get out of this depression, uh, we're going to understand that while with some of the suggestions of Yuval Noah Harari, um, the notion of a technocracy does get some well-deserved skepticism. To get out of the depression actually did require a technocracy. It did require a series of technical and technological steps to restart the economy. Since times were so bad, one of the ways that people made their dreary lives a little more happy was by going to the cinema. And I'm going to briefly discuss the artistic backdrop that modern times would have been screened in. Then we will consider Charlie Chaplin as a creative artist, really one of the greats of all times, and then look at the film itself, and then in anticipation of our reading of Brave New World, which came out at roughly the same time, um, you'll see how these two satires function with a different tone. Okay, so what is a depression? We hear a lot about depressions and a lot about recessions. A recession is, I believe, two successive quarters of economic non-growth, however they come to measure that. But a depression is much more severe. It is a breakdown in the system of capital, the system of investment, and therefore the system of employment. And I'm going to discuss briefly how those are linked. So, depression uh, can start with severely reduced economic activity, although the Great Depression was probably started by a sudden movement of capital, a disappearance of capital, so that economic activity was reduced, which would lead to mass unemployment. People had less money. Less money was chasing around the same amount of goods. which leads to deflation because less money was in circulation, which leads to less goods eventually, therefore reduced industrial capacity, which again leads to more mass unemployment. It becomes a vicious circle. Um, but what it really is an overall loss of confidence in the system. And if you are a part of the system, you lose confidence in yourself. A fact, psychological fact, which I think was very, very well illustrated in the Charlie Chaplin movie. Um, Harari, you will remember, since he is a huge booster for capitalism and legal fictions, concludes that money is the most universal and the most efficient system of mutual trust ever devised. However, if you are in a situation where you have lack of trust in capitalist arrangement of people, materials, and energy, uh, the system will no longer be able to reproduce the means of production. Um, how can these things function? Well, capital requires credit, which is essentially you buy money from a bank using something as collateral. If you purchase a home, you keep those payments up or you lose that house. Um, Stocks is when you own a tiny piece of a company. If you're Elon Musk, you own a big piece of a company. And if that company is making a profit, you gain value in two ways. One is that the stocks will pay a dividend. That is a little payout that comes at the end of every quarter. At least it does in my stocks. But more importantly, I think, is that the value of the stock itself goes up, and then you could sell it at a profit. However, if you do, you have to pay taxes on that as well. Then you have kind of slow-moving stocks, if I can call it that. Stocks you can buy and sell just about any old time you feel like, but bonds they have a date of expiry, and they pay a dividend at a consistent and steady rate throughout their life. These are usually the ways that some businesses raise money, but mostly a municipality or even a country raises money in this way. In the United States, these vehicles are called treasury bonds. Um, However, if you had stocks and bonds, what you could do is use them as collateral to take money out from a bank. So even though the value of your property could suddenly evaporate overnight, that could still be used as collateral to get more loans out of a bank. The financial crash of 2008, by the way, was triggered by a similar situation where you could collect a lot of outstanding debt and use that as a collateral on a new loan, even though you had no idea whatsoever if those people who had that debt were capable of paying it back. Generally, um, it it turned out that they could not. Okay, but let's not talk about the 2008 crisis. Let's focus on the big crash. Black Friday in October 1929. Please note the irony of Black Friday being the start of the Christmas shopping season in the North Atlantic industrialized West. It's true of the United States, and it is now even true of Norway. So there was what the historian Hugh Brogan, and it is primarily his narrative of the Great Crash that I am channeling here. It's what the historian Hugh Brogan attributed to unwarranted optimism in the economy and limitless greed among investors of all classes. Just about everybody was into stocks. One wit even heard his shoeshine boy talk about the stocks that he was going to invest in. Now remember, stocks and bonds can be used as collateral for loans, and the market is constantly increasing in value. That if you have unwarranted optimism, that means undeserved optimism, you would be likely to see the wisdom in borrowing more money on the speculative property that you already own to get even more of it. Um, in the United States at the time, this would have been after the First World War, there were high tariffs for import of goods. So this artificially increased the production in the United States, giving the impression of a robust economy. Measures of protectionism, they generally work, but they're best applied if they don't last for too long of a time. Uh, Also, the economy was so efficient that soon the market was saturated. There were more products made than there were buyers to buy them. First, this was in foodstuffs from farming, then in home construction, and it eventually even got to manufactured items like automobiles and clothing. Uh, the market went up and up and up during what was called the boom, also called the Jazz Age, 1924 to 1929, uh, where people were seduced into investing uh, in the market because they did not want to miss out. At a time when the population of the United States was well under 100 million, I would imagine, uh, uh, close to 10% of the people were investors in the stock market. And just statistically, it's unlikely that you would have that many wise investors. Also, you could buy stock on margin, which means that you could buy stock for 10% of its price, hang on to it, pay off the rest of the money you owe when the price goes up, uh, sell it at a huge profit. So you are able to borrow money to make even more money. Quoting historian Carol Quigley's wonderful contemporary history of the Western world, actually the globe, called Tragedy and Hope, he writes, by the spring of 1929, the boom had become a frenzy and was having profound effects on business activity, on domestic and international finance, on the domestic affairs of foreign countries, and on the psychology and modes of life of Americans. Uh, Let us see this in practice. Uh, in June of 1929, a Labour government was elected in the United Kingdom, and money, which could move freely back and forth, although goods could not, floods into the New York financial centers away from the United Kingdom. So there's suddenly a lot more money in America than there is stuff to buy it, increases the value of of prices. By September, the United Kingdom, to get capital back into their country, increases their interest rates to a whopping 6.5%. Now, money drains out of the financial centers, and major players have to sell off their stocks on Wall Street. This drives the prices down. However, if you have borrowed money to buy stocks at a 10% margin, but these stocks lose value, you have to get out of the market very, very quickly, or you will go broke. No, worse than broke. You will be totally bankrupt. So on the 23rd of October, 6 million shares were sold off. The next day, 13 million shares were sold off. Black Thursday. And then over the weekend, there was a calm period. And then on the 28th, Monday, 9 million shares sold off. Black Tuesday, 29th, the New York Stock Exchange acted like a zoo where the animals had gone mad, to quote Hugh Brogan. Over 60 million shares were sold off, losing $10 billion of value, which was twice the amount of money that existed as specie, bills and coins, in the country at that time. Banks closed and failed and led to the Great Depression, an era that it was named after an economic occurrence. But not only was the economy depressed, many people were depressed as well. There was no money available for investment. Therefore, without credit, you could not build factories or consume products. There was a scramble for cash, and there was a hoarding of silver and gold, which gold coins were still in circulation. There were massive layoffs of employees. Just by spring of the next year, over 3 million were laid off. Then, by the end of December, 5 million. By the end of the next year, 9 million. By the end of the next year, 13 million. By spring of 33, 16 million. In addition, the ecological catastrophe of the Dust Bowl, where all of the topsoil from the fertile Midwest created an artificial weather event due to the topsoil floating in the air, and this was caused by factory farming techniques. So there was a loss of jobs. It became hopeless to find any job that you had had before. It became hopeless to find any job. And if you had a bank loan that you gave your house or your farm or any other item as the collateral, you were going to lose that, and you would be homeless, as many people are today in the United States. And this, to feed these people, you had bread lines and soup kitchens where people would line up and get just enough to keep going. And if you live for a prolonged period of time in an improvised camp in a park, which was what Central Park in New York City became, you became desperate. So Franklin Roosevelt gets elected, and he suggests a New Deal for the American people. Takes office in 1933, and the immediate thing that he does is he seizes the airwaves and he speaks to the American public every Saturday afternoon as they would huddle around their radio and listen to this aristocratic New Yorker talk about how he was going to turn things around. And his famous phrase was, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Roosevelt recognized that the problem was mostly a psychological problem of lack of trust. He continued this message to the people every Saturday. Um, he opened some banks, guaranteeing their funds federally. He created a huge amount of alphabet bureaus with the assistance of 17, I think it ended up, 17 private corporations. And if you ascribe to this, like if you ran a shop or a store, you could have this poster that is on the right-hand side of the planch in the window. We operate under an approved code and display the blue-winged eagle as a symbol of our cooperation. Uh, what were they cooperating on? Well, for one thing, they would stop putting children to work. That's right. Child labor was, the banning of child labor was a direct result of the Great Depression. Um, so the National Recovery Administration, they had codes for industry. They established a minimum wage for the first time in history, a federal minimum wage, and they banned child labor. They also had a lot of make-work projects. Uh, Men without work wandering the countryside became a serious problem. Usually you could get arrested for vagrancy and put in jail. At least you would have a warm place to sleep and something to eat. And until the Works Progress Administration. And these were basically putting people together in work gangs. This, by the way, occurred on the state level and it occurred on the federal level. People built roads, tunnels, parks, basically everything but housing. It was mostly infrastructure construction projects, even to the level, I believe, of making railroad bed. But you also employed artists, post office murals, and the like. Also, people with college educations were given work to go out and discover folklore. Folkway Records, which is an imprimatur of records by the Smithsonian Institute, that was established at this time. And the writers Arthur Miller, the author, the playwright of Death of a Salesman, he was sent to the Appalachian Mountains with a primitive recording device to note down the dialects of the people that live there. Zora Neale Hurston, another very famous writer, an African-American woman from Florida, I believe, she was sent around to to record stories and folklore of the African-American population that had formerly been slaves. There were projects for schools. People were put to work raking leaves, anything to get them off the street and into meaningful labor. Although they generally were not living with their families, they were living in work camps. What did this achieve? Well, one is that there is a guarantee on bank deposits in America, I believe to $160,000 per depositor, much the way there is a guarantee on deposits here in Norway. There was a national pension, a retirement account. I believe if you worked for 15 years, you were entitled to a pension. I'm not sure, but I think even I may be entitled to a small American pension when I retire. Also, the Democratic Party became very popular with labor and blacks and European immigrants. There was a gradual radicalization of Americans in terms of labor unions. Socialism and communism became more acceptable, and a skepticism to big business, and also a rediscovery of Americana, Native Americans, bluegrass music, American folklore, just to name a few. Also, a lot of new infrastructure, roads, dams, the electrification of the Tennessee Valley, schools, and federal buildings. And up until the end of the Great Depression, if you wanted to read at night in many, many, many places in the United States, you had to light a candle or spark up a kerosene lantern. It also, however, increased the influence of the federal government in many aspects of American life. Some would maintain to the detriment of the country. Personally, I'm not so sure. Okay, so if you're depressed, what are you going to do for fun? You're going to go to the movies. And the cinema was America's television or America's YouTube of the time. You would go in, you would pay your money, you would watch a B film, which was very, very short, like a Gene Autry Western or a Charlie Chan movie or a Mr. Moto movie. And then you would take a little break, go out and smoke a cigarette, uh, if you could afford them, a bite to eat if you could afford them. You would return to the cinema, and before the major feature, there would be a series of escapist serials. Some of these were also westerns, but others were science fiction, like Flash Gordon. And then you would watch the feature-length film. Frequently, these were escapist fables, such as Tarzan, which was so popular that there were two Tarzans making two franchises of Tarzans at the same time. One was Buster Crabbe, and the other was Johnny Weissmuller. Just incidentally, my favorite Tarzan. But ironically, some of the most popular movies during the Depression were about people who were ridiculously rich. For instance, Fred Astaire films, Top Hat, Flying Down to Rio. In Top Hat, the whole people just run and they fly to Europe. In Flying Down to Rio, they're bored for the weekend, so they get in their airplanes and they go down to Rio de Janeiro. Incredible. But at any rate, the music was good, and Fred Astaire is just an amazing dancer. Which brings us to another great artist of the day, Charlie Chaplin. He grew up in a single parent home. Uh, to live, he was frequently sent to the workhouse, and this is from the age of 9, I believe. Uh, when he was a teenager, his mother went insane and had to be put in an asylum. And Charlie became a performer at, I think, age 14, doing routines in the music halls. At 19, he came to America and worked in the music halls of America. One of the comedic persons that he developed was the Tramp. And this, I'm not sure what the first one was, but it's featured in the Gold Rush, The Kid, really just many, many Charlie Chaplin movies. And he also did a lot of short films with this character, but Modern Times was the last film where he used this persona. You might have heard of The Great Dictator. This was Charlie Chaplin's first bona fide talkie. But He was also accused of having communist sympathies, an episode that turns up in Modern Times, by the way. He's accused of having communist sympathies, and he was blacklisted, and he has to leave America and settle in Switzerland, and he was not honored in his native country until he was well over 80 years old, where he got an honorary Oscar. Okay, I'd like to speak just a little bit about the movie itself. I hope you've watched it. It passes the wife movie test. Also, my kids even got through it. It is a silent movie, but it's short enough and focused enough that you can figure out what's going on. Every time there is a human voice saying words in this film, it is mediated. The boss of the factory, he only talks when he's on a television screen. The voice of the scientists that are introducing the eating machine are only on a phonograph record. So there is no spoken words in this movie, although Charlie Chaplin does sing in a quasi-Italian scat version of a song that he wrote while he is a waiter at a restaurant. But I would like to look at the images one by one. If we look at Charlie Chaplin, the tramp on the assembly line, you will notice that he's even making the motions of screwing those bolts when he is not on the assembly line, to the point where he actually goes after a woman's bosoms because she had two big octagonal buttons on her dress. So he becomes a part of the machine that way. Then there is the feeding machine, hands down my favorite scene in the movie, where to make the worker more efficient, they're going to feed him while he is working on the assembly line. And then this wonderful, almost ballet dance through the cogs of the machine, where Charlie Chaplin becomes part of a machine. This is also comedically run when Charlie Chaplin's co-worker and supervisor accidentally gets caught in the factory machine. Eventually he is laid off, and he and his sweetheart, the waif, uh, uh, are sitting in front of a suburban home, and they have a dream of what their personal dream home would be like. The waif gets a job in a restaurant as a waitress, I believe, and uh, Charlie Chaplin gets a job as a waiter and later a singing waiter, leading to the happy ending where they decide to go off into the sunset, and you'll see Charles Chaplin in the third photograph in the rightmost column, pointing to his mouth. And this brings us to the beautiful song Smile, written by Charlie Chaplin. In the module, I've included a Nat King Cole version. Very encouraging. Listen to the words. There will always be hope for tomorrow as Charlie Chaplin and the waif walk happily off into the sunset. So, while it is nice to have a job, the man-machine solution is perhaps not optimal, but the artistic solution does turn out to be successful for the couple, enabling them to reproduce the means of production. In the last planche, I would like to briefly compare this to the novel that some of you are already reading, The Brave New World, product of the same period. Also a satire. Not exactly a comedy, though. So We have modern times as socially realistic, and this is contrasted with Brave New World, which is a scientific dystopia. And yet, look at the prominence of mass production. Look at the prominence of assembly line, social engineering. Both of these works actually appeal to planned economies, and actually, as a satire, modern times is weaker uh, than Brave New World because he felt that in desperate times he had an obligation, Charlie Chaplin, to make it easier for the people who were down and out and coming to the cinema to forget their troubles.